Actually, it could have also been called from Geneva to Cali, or from Cali to Geneva. It depends how we want to present this. And so my name is Salvador. I represent the Justice here at the UN, and I'm also part of Gabriel, a UN on the block, which is the Geneva Human Rights, Biodiversity and Land Task Force, which is next to GECO. So we're a bit in GECO is the Geneva Climate Change Consultation Groups on climate. So now we're increasing the biodiversity of the different participants in let's say this Human Rights Council ecosystem. So the objective really is here to see the link between the coming session of COP16, which will take place in Cali, in Colombia, from the 21st of October to the 1st of November. And we're very happy to organize this with the mission, the permanent mission of Colombia, the host of this COP. And Miguel Ruiz Botero is at the moment still taken in a meeting, but he's going to join us in a few minutes. That's what it is, as you know, here in the council. There's a number of overlaps, all of our activities, but he's going to join us in just a few minutes. We're in close touch with him. Sorry. So, one of the important elements that happened at the last COP of the Convention on Biodiversity, and that was in 2022 in Montreal, was the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is today the main policy instruments for the work in the international work in the field of biodiversity. And it does see elements of language which say that this framework should follow a human rights-based approach, respecting, protecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights. And it also acknowledges the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And also, we will have, in view of this COP16, at this session of the Council, a resolution in order to prepare and send a message from the Human Rights Council to the COP16. So we're very happy to see and discuss the linkages between these different events and between these institutions. In order to start, we will give the floor to the special rapporteur on the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, Astrid Puentes, who has prepared a message. She's traveling at this moment, so she was really unable to be with us or even to be online with us, but she has prepared a video statement for this event. Yes, you should listen to her statement through the earphone.
And Land Task Force for organizing this very important side event during the 57th session of the Human Rights Council regarding biodiversity and human rights. Today, as we all know, humanity faces existential threats with the climate change, biodiversity, and pollution crisis aggravated by systemic inequalities. These crises are impacting the enjoyment of all human rights, including the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. While we face these urgent challenges,
to the Geneva Human Rights, Biodiversity, and Land Task Force for organizing this very important side event during the 57th session of the Human Rights Council regarding biodiversity and human
of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Therefore, the cumulative experience and expertise of the Human Rights Council is vital in the implementation of this global biodiversity framework. As it has been demonstrated over and over again, all actions related to face and solve the multiple planetary crises must have human rights at the center. This not only prevents further violations, but it also contributes to more effective measures, both in relation to biodiversity protection and climate action. Clarification of states' and businesses' obligations in relation to biodiversity protection can be significantly important towards the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. There are many examples, including regarding the content of the human right to a healthy environment that, of course, is in relation with the substantive and procedural elements, including access to information, participation, and access to justice that are absolutely key and very important for the implementation of this framework. In addition, the Council also has developed special measures that states should develop in relation to marginalized communities such as women, children, youth, indigenous peoples, people of African descent, peasants and rural communities that will be very valuable on the implementation of the framework. Therefore, it is very important to use all of this knowledge and pollinize the systems at the UN in order to advance effective measures. Therefore, I also celebrate this dialogue and all the opportunities around to collaborate, and I look forward in ways in which I can support from the mandate, the implementation of all of these solutions and identify more opportunities to continue collaborating. Thank you.
Great. This was a very clear message from the special rapporteur, and she will actually be attending the COP in Cali, as well as a number of other special procedures who will be present and active. And so let me turn now to the Office of the High Commissioner, to Nella Chernota, who's part of the team working on environment and climate change in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the office was present in Montreal, has been very active, and has also helped and discussed with a number of states and different stakeholders the preparation of the coming COP precisely on these human rights aspects. So Nella, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I will start with mentioning some interlinkages between biodiversity and human rights, and then I will address how the Human Rights Council and also the 16th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity that is taking place in October can help to advance a human rights-based biodiversity action and contribute to the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So according to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, the global rate of species extinction is already tens to hundreds times higher than the average rate over the past 10 million years, and it is accelerating. Biodiversity loss forms part of the multiple planetary crises that we are facing, and as pointed out by the two former special rapporteurs on human rights and the environment, in their reports on biodiversity and human rights from 2017 and 2020, humans are not separate from nature. Biodiversity and human rights are interdependent. And the full enjoyment of human rights, including among others, the right to life, right to health, cultural rights, right to self-determination, and others, depends on biodiversity. Importantly, and also as already mentioned by Astrid, healthy biodiversity and ecosystems are among the crucial elements of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment recognized by the Human Rights Council in 2021 and the UN General Assembly in 2022. As pointed out by the special rapporteurs on human rights and the environment, biodiversity loss undermines the ability of humans to exercise their human rights, and in addition, it has a disproportionate impact on those in already vulnerable situations and also those who are directly dependent on nature. At the same time, biodiversity conservation needs to be consistent with human rights. Of course, respecting, protecting, fulfilling human rights is an obligation under international human rights law, but it also leads to rights-based biodiversity action also leads to better outcomes for both people and biodiversity. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, KMGBF, which is a strategic plan for the implementation of the CBD from 2022 to 2030, reflects these interlinkages between biodiversity and human rights. As mentioned by Astrid, the framework's section C sets out that the implementation of the entire framework needs to follow a human rights-based approach, respecting, protecting, fulfilling, and promoting human rights. It explicitly acknowledges the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and mentions the right to development. And human rights elements also feature throughout the framework's targets. For example, Target 3 states that the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their traditional territories, need to be recognized in the context of conservation. Target 22 sets out to ensure effective and gender-responsive participation in decision-making and access to information and access to justice in relation to biodiversity. It also sets out to ensure full protection of environmental human rights defenders. Target 23 of the framework seeks to ensure gender equality in the implementation of the framework, in the implementation of the framework. And these are just some of the examples. There are many more human rights elements throughout the KMGBF. Among the key challenges to rights-based environmental action are the silos between the human rights and the environmental processes. And the CBD COP16 and also the current session of the Human Rights Council have the opportunity to break these silos and advance rights-based environmental action. I will first focus on the CBD and then I'll move on to the Human Rights Council. So, as I mentioned, the KMGBF includes multiple elements that are key for human rights. And the CBD COP16 will be taking multiple decisions this October, which should have human rights in their center. For example, it will be deciding on new areas of work under the convention that will be necessary to support the scientific and technical needs for the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And one of these areas should be equity and rights-based approaches to conservation, so that states are equipped with the necessary guidance to implement the framework in a way consistent with human rights. COP16 will also be deciding on resource mobilization, and it should emphasize that all financial flows related to biodiversity should be human rights enhancing, meaning they should protect the planet and people. COP16 will also be deciding on marine and coastal biodiversity conservation, and this decision should include that conservation of marine and coastal biodiversity should be rooted in human rights. And it should also advance efforts to protect environmental human rights defenders active in the context of marine and coastal biodiversity. As to the Human Rights Council mechanisms have already provided some guidance on rights-based biodiversity action to former special rapporteurs on human rights and the environment produced reports that I mentioned, clarifying the interdependence between biodiversity and human rights. The next report of the current special rapporteur on the right to healthy environment will be on oceans, which is also of great relevance for biodiversity. Biodiversity loss is also recognized as a human rights issue in several Human Rights Council resolutions. For example, Resolution 5223 on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment from last year, April, recognized that the loss of biodiversity often results and reinforces patterns of discrimination, and environmental harm can have disastrous consequences for the quality of life of indigenous peoples, local communities, peasants, and others who rely directly on biodiversity. As Yves mentioned, multiple special procedures mandate holders will also participate at COP16 in Cali this October. And currently, as you know, Colombia and Costa Rica are bringing forward a new Human Rights Council resolution on human rights and biodiversity, which OHCHR very much welcomes and hopes that the resolution will provide an opportunity to engage more deeply on biodiversity and human rights at the Human Rights Council, and that it will help to generate more of the necessary guidance for states on biodiversity and human rights. We also hope that it will help with the implementation of the KMGBF and that it will further help to break these silos between environmental and human rights processes and help to tackle the crisis of biodiversity loss in a truly transformative and just manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelafa. That was really a very good overview of the different linkages between human rights instruments and this new global biodiversity framework. And you also underline a number of the challenges. And indeed, this discussion is a very important one because this question of biodiversity are one of the substantial elements of the implementation of a right to a healthy and sustainable environment. So we need this type of dialogue on both sides. But there's also, and as you mentioned it, a procedural aspect. A number of the procedural human rights are absolutely needed for the implementation of both the human rights instruments and the Convention on Biodiversity. And of course, we should not forget, because that's something important in the Convention on Biodiversity, the specific elements of that convention which refer to indigenous people's rights, or to the rights of indigenous people. So we're very happy now to follow this general view by focus on two different elements which are part of this general dialogue. And I will start with Bruna de Almeida Campoa, Bruna, you are senior campaigner and offshore oil and gas campaigner at the CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law. You've been following these issues very, very closely. You will be also in Cali with a number of events and a number of interventions. So we're very happy to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me here. So my name is Bruna Kamps, and I work for the Center for International Environmental Law. And I'm here. My focus is really going to go on fossil fuel use in production and kind of going on what Nella has already explained, these silos. And I'm going to try to break down the silos and how sort of human rights and biodiversity can, when you're tackling a human rights-based approach to achieving the global biodiversity framework, how you can actually tackle those silos. So I think one of the first things that we can do is already recognize that the global biodiversity framework already mentions specifically the right, acknowledges the human right to clean and healthy and sustainable environment. And not just that, also that in the Human Rights Council, there's also an acknowledgement by the Special Rapporteurs last year in November of sort of the impacts of biodiversity loss to human rights. So there's by first starting there, we can already go in sort of like what are the next steps and what needs to happen. So first of all, fossil fuels, we just need to remember that fossil fuels are a common root cause of the triple planetary crisis. And this includes biodiversity loss, but not just toxic pollution and climate change. And specifically, fossil fuel production and use is threatening biodiversity. Oil and gas exploitation directly impacts human rights, and particularly communities that are dependent on biodiversity across the life cycles. And the biodiversity impacts are things like the loss of ecosystems and deforestation, pollution, oil spills. All of this harms indigenous peoples and local communities, and those, especially communities that are specifically based on fishing, agricultural, natural resource harvesting, and all of this is mostly threatened with biodiversity loss. And I'll just give you a very concrete example. So in Brazil, there is a network of women from the Costa do Corais. They have recently been documented the impact of a recent oil spill that has not allowed them to actually be able to sell their product, mostly shellfish. And not just that, they've also been documenting their impact on health. So specifically, these women have to go into the water to be able to get the nets out. So it's artisanal fishery. So it's very much like a hands-on kind of experience. And what happens is that they've had an increase of uterus cancer because they go into a water that is entirely polluted by oil. So it's just an example of sort of where the loss of biodiversity and the health also impact on human rights, what that actually means concretely to a specific coastal community. And then also my focus also obviously is on offshore oil and gas. And so one of the things that I also want to remember is that often biodiversity is not really well clear and known to people. So oceans, for example, the health of the oceans is often not really clearly seen. It's sort of out of sight, out of mind. But offshore drilling has a major impact on coastal communities. And this is seen throughout sort of many different experiences that have happened with offshore oil spills, where the communities are the most affected, like the fishing communities, but not just. So obviously, if your community is entirely based on tourism, your community is also going to be you're also going to have a problem. But it's not just sort of like if you have a business around it, also just substantive when you do substantive fishing, so you fish for your own community, that has also major issues for that community. And this is well documented, for example, in Nigeria. So those are all just different examples of sort of how biodiversity loss has an impact on human rights, but there's also another impact another problem that we also need to recognize is that there really isn't a space for environmental defenders or indigenous people to come in to, let's say, the frontline defenders to come in and actually voice out their opinions, and that protection of the civil space also needs to be well established with sort of when we were implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I'll just give another example. So at the moment, we're currently witnessing that women from Guyana, so they're the Red Thread, it's an NGO, it's a network of women, they're being harassed, they're being threatened because they're speaking out against oil and gas in Guyana. And so this is the type of sort of communities that also need to be supported, and they need to be protected if they're going to voice out their opinions. There's also sort of fisherfolk in Honduras also being threatened, or we had the case of a fisherman who didn't want to go home because he was worried that sort of they would know where his family is and where they live. So not being able to even go home is a bit of an issue. So this is just to illustrate where sort of where there's activities like oil and gas, it can often mean that if a community expresses their concerns for the biodiversity loss, for the impacts on the environment, they will be threatened and harassed, and they're not able to actually to express themselves. And then the last thing I just want to also point out is that there's a these impacts often in the communities or that witnessed by communities is usually not documented, and there is a lack of sort of being able to incorporate indigenous knowledge into also the global biodiversity framework, but I'm not sure the global biodiversity is within the CBD context. So the convention itself usually uses really hard science and facts, which is important, but it's also important to recognize that Indigenous people also have sort of knowledge that needs to be integrated into sort of decision making, and that knowledge needs to be sort of in not just in deciding whether a species needs to be protected or not, but also in how you're conserving and managing a species or a habitat. So there's a couple of recommendations that we are wanting to make. So for one thing is obviously national decisions and plans need to take into account aspects like sectoral aspects like offshore oil and gas. And this means that national action plans for biodiversity, so also called the NBSAPs, need to explain how they're going to actually halt the expansion of oil and gas, and that needs to be really recorded in each country. And as a first step, for example, we can already start with protected areas or biodiversity hotspots. So that's a low-hanging fruit. If you already documented that the area is important for biodiversity and that activity should not be occurring in that protected area. And then also there needs to be a better regulation of industry, a more robust regulation of industries. And it's really important that this is consistent with the precautionary principle, which is often sort of not taken into account. So if usually you have to document a risk or an impact and have to clearly say that there was an impact before it's actually taken into account. If with oil and gas, it's a risk, so you really need to take precaution around it. You can't wait until something bad has actually happened before you actually take action. So and then the other aspect that I mentioned is also protecting frontline defenders. I think this is first and foremost this is the recommendation also for the CBD. It's really important that that it's prioritized, the civic space is prioritized, and that there's measures, for example, to prosecute and when there's a repression and discrimination against frontline defenders. So those are just a couple of examples for recommendations. And thank you so much.
Thank you to you, Bruna. And it's quite an interesting element that you're putting on the table to see that perhaps some of the language which is used here in the Human Rights Council, like human rights defenders, or we talk about environmental human rights defenders, should probably also find its way into the in the practice and in some of the documents of the Convention on Biodiversity. Unfortunately, we should say, because there is a very big need there for stronger protections for people who are trying to protect biodiversity and ecosystems. You've shown also the direct impact of one industry here, the oil industry. There are indeed, unfortunately, through pollutions, a number of impacts on biodiversity, but there's also a link which is starting to be really developed, both, I mean, in different forums and between biodiversity and climate change. We know that also in the UNFCCC, this issue has been raised. So we see that it's not only just the field of human rights that needs to be more connected and better connected with the institutions working on biodiversity, but there's also here the ones who are directly working on climate change. And of course, healthy ecosystems are part of the mitigation and adaptation on climate change. So there's an important here, I would say, virtual triangle to be developed. Let me turn now to another issue, which is quite important, precisely these linkages that I was mentioning. And so Alexandra Gusanishi represents Sofagaka International here at the Human Rights Council, and she's also one of the leaders of the Gerbil Task Force. So Alex, thank you for organizing this event, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves. Hi everyone. So as Yves mentioned, I'm a member of the Gerbil, and I'm also part of a working group, of which some of us are also part, which is a civil society working group that is focusing on human rights and biodiversity on the CBD. And this working group is across constituencies, so it has indigenous people representative, youth, women caucus representative, NGOs, bigger NGOs. And I'm mentioning that because this working group has been really following the CBD process and the global biodiversity framework negotiations from a human rights perspective, and really advocating from the start to get human rights throughout the framework. So we are very happy with the result, of course. And throughout the process, the working group published various briefs to really show where in the text there could be really important aspects where human rights could be integrated. And now that the global biodiversity framework has been adopted and is now we're in the phase of implementation, the working group has been working to publish a guide. It's a very concise guide that's called From Agreements to Actions, a guide to applying a human rights-based approach to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's the full title. If you type it in Google, you will find it. It's now in English, in French, and it will be soon published in Spanish. It's a short guide, and it's really aiming to be an instrument to signpost mostly. So to really show where in the global biodiversity framework we have human rights language, and what other instruments it relates to, what does it look like in practice with a resource of key questions, with the resource of a list of resources of key questions for really at the national and subnational level, thinking about how do we implement the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework from a human rights-based approach. So this guide, it really is no, I think maybe what I will mention from the start is that one of the outcomes from coming together for this guide is that we really realize, and that's why as civil society, we absolutely support and really advocate for more guidance and very concrete support to states, to rights holders in terms of implementing biodiversity and also triangling with climate action from a human rights perspective and approach. But this guide has 4 sections. The first one is really about what is a human rights-based approach and who are the rights holders, and also who are the stakeholders and who are the duty bearers. And so it focuses on what the Global Biodiversity Framework highlights, which is also children and youth, women and girls, people living in coastal and rural areas, local communities, and of course the rights of indigenous peoples. And then the second part of the guide looks at what are the foundational elements of a human rights-based approach, and we focus also on elements that are in the GBF, so equity, participation, and access to justice, especially. It links again to other instruments, to already existing instruments, regional instruments. So it's really a really a guiding tool to show where other instruments are already existing, resources. And then the next section, the third section, looks at how do we integrate a human rights-based approach in key processes for biodiversity policy. So it looks at the national planning mechanisms, financing, and then monitoring and reporting. Of course, the guide doesn't go into detail. It really just signposts what could be key questions to address at national level and at sub-national level. And the last section looks at concrete thematic elements that were not dealt elsewhere, such as land tenure and land use change, or sea tenure and marine resources, nature-based solutions, and customary sustainable use. So I think I'm mentioning this guide to really show how civil society came together and it keeps coming together to really support an implementation of biodiversity action from a human rights-based approach and perspective. And the point that I mentioned at the beginning is that we really realized, and that's why we truly support the resolution that is coming, and really efforts to bridge these policy frameworks between human rights, biodiversity, where in another process as part of this working group, we held a dialogue series where we convened various actors, indigenous people, local communities, representative, women, youth, and member states, researchers as well. And interestingly, so it was a dialogue series that will continue until COP16 in Cali, to look at what concrete stories, concrete examples, concrete cases of implementation exist already and what we can learn from these. But one interesting element that came from these online consultation and in-person consultation was that there is overall a thirst and need for more concrete guidance, more concrete support to states and to all other actors, rights holders as well, around capacity building, awareness raising of a human rights-based approach. And so that's why I think this guide is an important part, but we are very much looking forward to concrete actions such as the resolution and such as many events and actions that will take place also during COP16 to bring this human rights-based approach really central to biodiversity action. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Alexandra. I think this is a very clear introduction of what is coming up in Cali in October. So now let me turn to the last, but of course, definitely not the least of our speakers, Miguel Ruiz Rotero, who is a representative of the permanent mission of Colombia to the UN and their international organizations in Geneva. Miguel, thank you very much for being with us. We knew that you had another call, and so you've been informed about what were the content of the different contributions. So you did not just hear the last ones; you knew also the first ones. And so basically, as a key player now in these connections between biodiversity and human rights, as a host of the COP in Cali and as a co-sponsor with Costa Rica, basically being the core group of more than the sponsors, but really tabling the resolution in view of COP16. What do you see of what you heard about the challenges and the perspectives? What are the answers that you can perhaps give or perhaps not give in your role of host of COP? We're really looking forward to your contribution. Once again, thank you very much for being with us.
Of course. Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you very much to Gerbil for organizing this side event and inviting us to contribute. We're very happy to be here and to be able to socialize with you our views and our initiative on this matter. I think there's been ample illustration of human rights issues that are intimately linked to biodiversity that has already been made by other speakers. I would like to add to that, or perhaps emphasize on one point that is particularly important for Colombia, and it's that the human rights implications of biodiversity loss and the human rights implications that are linked to biodiversity matters are most dire generally in developing countries, and particularly within developing countries, they are most often suffered by those who are most vulnerable within society. And in that sense, this is a matter that we believed was extremely important, particularly to developing countries, and that's also why we have taken this initiative. We've also identified perhaps a gap in the Human Rights Council, and that is former speakers were talking about the importance of tackling the triple planetary crisis. And as you will identify, if you take a good look at the work of the Human Rights Council, you will find that one of the components of the triple planetary crisis, namely biodiversity loss, is not on the agenda of the Human Rights Council at the moment. We already have a mandate and resolutions and a stream of work on climate change. We already have a mandate as well, and a stream of work on chemicals and toxics and so on. But at the moment, we do not have a stream of work on biodiversity issues. As COP16 president, and particularly as well on the heels of agreement being reached on the GBF, that includes, as you know, particularly in section C, on implementation considerations, important linkages between the implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity and its GBF and protection of human rights. We believe that it was important to prioritize first an approach of peace with nature, which, as you'll see, is the theme of COP16, but also not only as a theme, but as a general approach to implementation of CBD obligations. We believed as such that it was incumbent on us to take steps to close this gap in the agenda of the Human Rights Council. And this is why, along with Costa Rica, we've decided to propose a draft resolution on biodiversity and human rights. As it is a new initiative, we've sought to keep the initiative grounded and simple to make certain that biodiversity matters are integrated into the Human Rights Council agenda, and that hopefully it allows us in the future to potentially, and if there is appetite for members, to scale up efforts in this field. Hopefully in the future, we will be able to have more ambitious action in the field of human rights, particularly the Human Rights Council. However, at this stage, we aim to achieve mainly two objectives from the text that we will be putting forward that will be in consultations from tomorrow. The first one is to allow the OECHR to provide technical support to states in implementing the GBF in line with relevant human rights considerations and obligations. And the second is to request the Office of the High Commissioner to report on outcomes and advances of COP16, and hopefully in the future on subsequent COPs of the Convention on Biological Diversity, in how Section C is being implemented and relevant human rights considerations in the GBF are being implemented. We understand, of course, that this is not as ambitious as we would like it to be, but this is something that we believe can garner important support and can help us work in incremental ways to making further progress on the field of biodiversity and human rights. Our main objective in this is to be able, as we said, to stop that gap from existing and to make certain that the triple planetary crisis is tackled integrally through the Human Rights Council, but also to make certain that in discussing biodiversity, we do not allow for a narrative that excludes issues of human rights from discussion of issues of biodiversity and from issues of implementation of environmental obligations. We are very much convinced of the fact that those two things are completely interrelated, and that as the triple planetary crisis intensifies, the linkages between human rights and environmental matters increases and increases every day much more. And in that sense, we do believe that it is important that we set the basis now for action in the Human Rights Council so that we can respond to the growing implications of the triple planetary crisis, not only in the field of environment, but also in those that are related. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Miguel. That was really very clear, and it's quite interesting to see that what is going to happen this week is in a way one of the first steps for COP16. So COP16 is already starting in Geneva. We were wondering at the beginning whether we're talking about Geneva to Cali or Cali through Geneva. Well, it's going to be both, if I understand. Now it's from Geneva to Cali, and then afterwards the implementation of the resolution, if it passes, and we look forward to that, will be then from Cali to Geneva. So this is quite a very interesting development. Thank you very much for this. So now we have some time to take up a few questions. I wanted to see in the audience before I ask the panelists if ever they also themselves have questions among themselves, and before also they will provide a very short final word. If there are questions in the audience. Okay, so I'll take two questions then, Switzerland, and afterwards the person behind.
Stephen, thank you for the panelists for the discussion today. I'm very much welcome. First of all, thank you for the various references to the mental health environment. Switzerland is with others, the core group. We still think it's a very important reference milestone that we did a couple of years ago. Also very much welcome the initiative of Colombia and Costa Rica to come with an initiative this session and have a resolution on biodiversity and human rights. We very much welcome this initiative. It's a welcome discussion. In particular, my personal impression is that it comes at a very timely point, as in particular in Europe and more in Switzerland. That's an issue that is currently very much discussed, be it in the European Union and well, in particular in Switzerland, where we have to vote on this issue in some 10 days, and don't know what's going to be the outcome of this, but since in Switzerland we have this situation that we have these popular initiatives, and then that generates discussions among the people in the country. It's an opportunity to advance the topic, and having a resolution in this council again is also an opportunity to advance this discussion. If panelists are interested, I have two questions for them, or 2 points or remarks. Looking at the situation in Switzerland, I have the impression that everybody supports biodiversity, and that's a wonderful thing, and that's good, as long as it's not necessarily in your proper garden. And as soon as in proper garden, or in your proper village, or in your proper area, and it touches your economic interests or other personal interests, then it gets more complicated. And this is a little bit, I have the impression, at the turning point, and more people see that actually biodiversity is not only an ideal, but actually is something that touches on personal interests too, and see that, well, we have to find a balance. And I wonder whether that is just an impression that we get here in Switzerland, or you see that abroad too. And the second question, and that is very much a discussion in Switzerland, where we see that we have to balance the interest of having more biodiversity with in our country, and on the other hand, we have to implement policies to promote new energy institutions or infrastructure, and this infrastructure goes into areas where biodiversity is vulnerable. Therefore, there is a balance. And I wonder whether you have this discussion also elsewhere, where you have actually both sides, environmental interests, you have to balance them. Yes, 2 questions for a panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll take the questions there in the back. because in this time.
My question is, Switzerland, that the environmental issues related to the biodiversity. I belong to a country which is not developed country, it's a developing country, and we have so many issues, environmental issues, issues, and the ecosystem overwhelmed by by using the place that is just like a Switzerland, and then the pollution is there because of the they are neglecting the warnings of the board who is connected and who is responsible for the pilgrims and visitors to come to the place to visit the for different reasons. They have a religious reason that they are visiting, that is different, but they were suggested that 36,000 people every year should visit a small valley is known as Pahalgam, where there's a water source, sweet water source, which is very important for the local people, and it has been polluted by visiting 500,000 people every year, because by visiting the place, they will get more money. And now they are starting different industries there, which is polluting the environment. And it is a warning for the local people that they are getting so many issues with these outsiders. Therefore, what is the policy of UN? Because we are hearing here that environmental issues are there. There are climate changes there. Globally, we have so many issues. How we can overcome all these issues, and how we can address locally these issues, because there are not local NGOs, there are not local government who can address these issues. How can we, how this platform, how these NGOs can use their pressure or the platform to assemble the people to get more information about the place where they are using the place for their interests, for the political interests, not for the local interest.
Third and final question here.
Yes, thank you so much, Ghazali Ohorella with the International Indian Treaty Council, which is an Indigenous Peoples organization with over 300 Indigenous peoples as members. Thank you so much for organizing this panel, and I very much echo the remarks made by the distinguished representative of Colombia, that yeah, you do see a stream on climate change and pollution within the HRC. However, a robust stream on biodiversity is still lacking, and for that, really much appreciate the initiative by Colombia in this upcoming resolution, and what I understand Costa Rica as well, obviously, and hopefully this will grow into into more initiatives. Just so much of something that I would like to flag. Obviously, we're very keen on interacting with the informals later on. But we do also see a trend in the UN ecosystem of lumping together Indigenous peoples with local communities and other groups, even though like Indigenous peoples have the unique status under international law. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is one of them. So I would like to request actually that to the core group and also the panelists to keep that in mind, that Indigenous peoples have this unique status. And to not, as a matter of, let's put it very, very easily, of convenience to the Indigenous peoples, local communities, et cetera, because that kind of like waters down the status of Indigenous peoples. Doesn't mean that we're not agreeing with peasants, people of African descendants, but it is very important that this distinction is kept. So hopefully that can be taken into account by the panel and also by the core group as well. We would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the three. I will start by giving the floor to Ella, as the UN has been directly.
One of the questions was addressed to the UN, and then I'll give the floor for answers and a final comment to all of the panelists, and you'll be you will have the final word, Miguel. So Nella, if you want to first answer the question, if you have another final word also to share with the audience.
I will also try to answer two questions in one. I will also tackle with the same the question from Switzerland, because I think the questions are very related. It's about the balancing of rights, and I think international human rights law has developed a response to balancing rights and because it is not unusual that human rights conflict with each other, because it often can happen that the right to property may conflict with either somebody else's right to property or with the environment, and so. But at the same time, it can be collective rights and individual rights. And in general, international human rights law responds to that in a way that any restriction on rights needs to be lawful, needs to be in accordance with the law, needs to pursue a legitimate aim, which can be the protection of the environment. It can be the protection of another right, which is, for example, the right to a healthy environment. It needs to be necessary and proportionate, and also it needs to be discriminatory, with which I'm also referring to the second question, which is that often, be it biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, affects mostly those who are in vulnerable situations already or dependent on nature, and it should not happen that those who are already most affected by biodiversity loss also pay for the price of conservation, for example. So what I'm trying to say is that the rights of those who are most affected, be it by biodiversity loss or conservation, for example, they need to be able to participate, to have the possibility to meaningfully express their views on the processes from the very outset. They need to be heard. They need to have information. They need to be informed about all of the impacts that it may have on their human rights, and they need to be able to have a say in the process. And in case their rights are violated, they need to be able to access justice for those impacts. I hope that helps to respond to the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruna. Shortly.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back. I'm going to try to answer a couple of questions. I think with the question from Switzerland regarding sort of everyone's supposed to biodiversity as long as it's not in your own backyard kind of a situation. I think there is an aspect of informed decision. So I like the Swiss system of referendums. It's quite an interesting one. It doesn't happen in Europe. It's one of the few that goes to that level of local sort of voting. But what's interesting is being able to have the information to be able to make that decision. And what you're saying is that I think here there is much more informed decision making compared to many other parts of the world. So often sort of the risks and the impacts are not well understood or acknowledged, and so therefore the decisions, not just from the perspective of a government taking a decision, is not possible. Also, the information is not unbiased. It's often biased. The data that's collected sometimes is like, if I work very much with the oil and gas industry, but like it's oil and gas usually does pay to collect certain type of data, and so that will be biased information. So it's really important that information is unbiased and it's accessible to everyone, and so that informed decisions can be made not just by governments, but also by people who are, let's say, making a vote in a referendum. So that's the first thing I would say, and that information is also goes into sort of education and sort of making sure that people are able to actually make an educated vote.
Very shortly.
Yeah, sorry. And then just to say that the balance of interest with more biodiversity and other policies and infrastructure is interesting. So just one thing to highlight, that in Europe, I know that's not Switzerland, this is the EU, they recently passed the nature restoration law. And this is really important because it's one of the few places in the world where nature has become so degraded that you need to pass a new law to restore nature. And we don't want to be there for the rest of the world. We want to ensure that biodiversity is not lost to the extent that we have to pass a new law to restore, which costs much more money. So Europe now has to pay a lot of more money, so the EU, to actually restore that biodiversity that has been lost. So just to remember that. Sorry.
Okay. We have to give the room in 2 minutes.
Sorry.
Well, please. Yeah, thank you. Alex is giving her her turn, and Miguel for a final word and an answer to the different questions. Thank you very much. Please.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to answer one of the questions that was posed by Switzerland regarding this perhaps a sort of dichotomy between biodiversity and protection of biodiversity and economic development. And I thank you for this question because it allows me to elaborate on the concept of peace with nature that we've put forward. As you'll see, what we want to do is to move past this dichotomy between nature and economic development, and that's rooted in a key reason. Economic development, as has been done in the past 2 centuries, has often been violent to nature and key ecosystems and the vital ecosystem services that they provide. These are also vital to economic development, and they're often overlooked when we, in essence, calculate what the pros and cons are of conserving biodiversity versus pursuing some sort of economic development that can be violent to nature. Our belief is that the conservation of biodiversity is not only necessary, but sine qua non to continued and sustainable development. And in the end, if we cannot make peace with nature and adequately conserve biodiversity, we will be hindering economic sustainable development in the future. And in that sense, these are 2 things that are not in conflict with each other, but that should be mutually reinforcing for economic development. And we won't be able to have sustained economic development without that. And in that sense, I think what Bruno was saying is very important. If you'll see in developing countries, which are the large majority of mega diverse countries, we haven't had this development that has been very destructive to nature. And in that sense, what we really wouldn't want to see is to follow that same course of development that is destructive to nature, because the repository of the world's biodiversity is the developing world. And in that sense, what we want to do is to be able to make peace with nature so that we're able to make our own path of economic development, and an economic development that is no longer violent with nature, but that is done together with nature.
Thank you very much for these final words. Big round of applause for all of the speakers. And as we heard, it was really great to hear also the 2 core groups joining their views. So as we said, we are on a journey now from Geneva to Cali, and we look forward to have everybody's support in this journey. Thank you very much. And please, for other discussions, can this happen outside so that the next events can immediately start? Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Oh.